The sun was setting over the valley of Sodom, but it was no ordinary twilight. There was a weight in the air, a static electricity that made the hair on your arms stand up, as if the earth itself were holding its breath before a scream. The sky had turned a bruised purple, slashed with veins of angry orange, and the shadows stretching from the walls of Sodom seemed to reach out like grasping fingers. Something ancient was stirring. Something terrible was about to be unleashed, and most of the city's inhabitants were too drunk on their own depravity to notice that their final hours had already begun. Sodom was not merely a city of sin. It was an abyss of darkness that had begun to leak into the spiritual realm, a place where the boundary between the human and the demonic had worn dangerously thin. Within its colossal walls of black stone, practices occurred that would make the demons themselves uncomfortable. The city had become a factory of wickedness, churning out new forms of evil as if it were a competition. Every imaginable perversion had been normalized, then exceeded, then forgotten in favor of something worse. The outcry of the victims, the screams of the innocent, the groans of the oppressed had been rising like black smoke for years, piercing the veil between earth and heaven. And finally, those cries had reached the throne of the Most High, the God who is slow to anger, who delays judgment hoping for repentance, who takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, had heard enough. The measure of Sodom's iniquity had become full, the cup of divine patience had overflowed, and now judgment was walking across the dusty hills toward the city gates, wearing the disguise of weary travelers. 3 figures moved through the shimmering heat of the late afternoon, but only one of them was heading to Abraham's tent. The other 2 had a different destination, a final destination. But before the angels reached Sodom, something extraordinary happened. Abraham, the friend of God, saw the 3 visitors approaching his tent near the oaks of Mamre. He ran to meet them, bowing low, offering hospitality with an urgency that suggested he recognized, perhaps only intuitively, that these were no ordinary travelers. He had Sarah prepare bread, selected a choice calf for his servants to cook, and stood by them under the trees as they ate. And then came the announcement that would change his life. Sarah, barren for decades, would have a son within a year. But it was what came next that reveals one of the most mysterious and haunting moments in Scripture. The Lord, appearing in human form alongside his angels, said something remarkable. "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do?" God was deliberating. The creator of the universe was deciding whether to share his plans with a mere mortal. And then he revealed it. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. God was going to investigate personally. The judge of all the earth was descending to examine the evidence before pronouncing sentence. This raises a dark mystery that has puzzled scholars for millennia. God is omniscient. He knows everything. He does not need to go down and see anything. So why this language? Some suggest it reveals God's justice. He does not condemn based on rumor alone, but verifies every accusation. Others propose something more unsettling, that the sin of Sodom had grown so monstrous, had crossed so many forbidden boundaries, that even the description of it required personal divine inspection. What exactly was happening in that city that demanded God himself come to witness it before destroying it utterly? As 2 of the visitors departed towards Sodom, Abraham remained standing before the Lord, and then began one of the most audacious negotiations in human history. Abraham, suddenly realizing that his nephew Lot lived in that doomed city, began to bargain with God. Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? It was an extraordinary moment of intercessory courage. A man standing before the infinite God, challenging him to act according to his own character. God agreed to spare the city for 50 righteous. So Abraham pressed further. What if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city because of 5 people? Again, God agreed. Abraham continued his desperate bargaining. 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. Each time, the Lord patiently agreed. If there were only 10 righteous people in all of Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities would be spared. 10 out of what may have been tens of thousands of inhabitants. The conversation ended, and Abraham returned home. But notice the silence that follows. Abraham stopped at 10. He did not go lower. Perhaps he believed surely there must be at least 10. Perhaps he was afraid of the answer. There were not even 10. In the entire city of Sodom, among all its inhabitants, there were not 10 righteous people. The city that had seemed so prosperous, so powerful, so permanent, did not contain enough goodness to justify its continued existence. The salt had lost its savor. The infection had spread to every cell. The judgment that was coming was not divine cruelty. It was divine surgery, cutting out a cancer before it could spread further and consume everything it touched. The 2 angels arrived at Sodom in the evening. They found Lot sitting in the gateway of the city. This detail is significant. The city gate was where legal and business transactions occurred, where the elders sat, where social status was displayed. Lot had achieved a position of prominence in Sodom. He had moved from pitching his tent near Sodom to living in Sodom to sitting in its gates. The gradual progression of compromise had brought him to the very heart of the city he should have fled years earlier. When he saw the 2 strangers, something in his spirit recognized that they were not ordinary men. He bowed low and urgently invited them to stay at his house. The angels initially refused, saying they would spend the night in the square, but Lot insisted so strongly that they finally agreed. His urgency was not mere hospitality. Lot knew what would happen to strangers who spent the night in the open in Sodom. He had seen it before. The streets after dark belonged to predators. The city that gleamed with wealth and sophistication by day became a hunting ground by night. Lot's conscience, which the Apostle Peter tells us was tormented day after day by the lawless deeds he saw and heard, drove him to protect these visitors from what he knew was coming. Lot prepared a meal for his guests. He baked bread without yeast, a detail that would later become significant when the Israelites fled Egypt in haste. The angels ate, maintaining their disguise as ordinary travelers. But before they could lie down for the night, before the household had settled into sleep, a sound began to grow outside. It started as distant shouting, then footsteps, then the unmistakable roar of a mob. The men of Sodom from every part of the city, young and old, surrounded the house. Every single one of them. The text emphasizes this totality, not some of the men, not a group of troublemakers, all of them. They called out to Lot with a demand so vile that centuries of readers have struggled to process it. Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, so that we can have sex with them. This was not a request. It was a demand backed by the threat of collective violence. The entire male population of the city had surrounded one house with the intention of gang-raping two strangers. This was Sodom's version of a welcome party. This was what they did to visitors. This was the sin that had cried out to heaven with such volume that God himself had come down to investigate. Lot went outside and closed the door behind him. What he said next reveals how deeply the corruption of Sodom had infected even this righteous man. "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have two daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." Lot offered his own virgin daughters to a mob to protect his guests. The hospitality code of the ancient Near East had become so twisted in his mind that he would sacrifice his children to honor it. Sodom had done its work on Lot's soul. The mob was not interested in the daughters. They wanted the men. Their rejection of the offer reveals something important. This was not primarily about sexual desire. This was about dominance, violence, humiliation. They wanted to violate the strangers specifically to demonstrate their power, to defile the visitors, to prove that no one entered Sodom without submitting to their authority. "Get out of our way," they replied to Lot. "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." They pressed forward, moving to break down the door. And then the angels acted. They reached out, pulled Lot back inside the house, and shut the door. What happened next was the first taste of judgment. The angels struck the men outside with blindness. But this was no ordinary blindness. The Hebrew word used here, sanvarim, appears only one other time in all of Scripture, when the Syrian army was blinded by Elisha. It suggests not just physical darkness, but a supernatural disorientation, a blindness that affected the mind as well as the eyes. The men of Sodom stumbled about, unable to find the door, groping in darkness, yet still trying to break in. Their madness was so complete that even blindness did not stop their assault. Inside the house, the angels revealed their mission to Lot. "Do you have anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here, because we are going to destroy this place." The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it. The pretense was over. The travelers had shown their true nature. Heaven had sent executioners, and Lot had been entertaining them unaware. The hours of mercy were running out like sand through a broken hourglass. Lot went out to warn his sons-in-law. The men pledged to marry his daughters. "Hurry and get out of this place, because the Lord is about to destroy the city." But they thought he was joking. They laughed at him. The man who had compromised so much to fit into Sodom had lost all credibility. His years of going along to get along meant that when he finally spoke truth, no one believed him. His urgent warning sounded like the ravings of a madman or the punchline of a bad joke. They stayed in their beds. They stayed in Sodom. They stayed to die. With the coming of dawn, the angels became insistent. "Hurry, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished." But even then, Lot hesitated. He lingered. The Hebrew word suggests he dawdled, delayed, could not bring himself to leave. After all those years in Sodom, his roots had grown too deep. His house, his possessions, his position, his comfortable life, all of it was here. How do you walk away from everything you have built, even when angels are telling you it is about to be destroyed? When he still hesitated, the angels seized his hand and the hands of his wife and 2 daughters and led them forcibly out of the city. The text says this was because the Lord was merciful to them. Sometimes mercy looks like being dragged away from what we love, but what is killing us. Sometimes salvation feels like violence because we have become so attached to our chains. God did not ask Lot's permission. He sent angels to grab him by the hand and pull him out of the fire whether he wanted to go or not. As soon as they were outside the city, one of the angels gave a command that carried the weight of cosmic law. Flee for your lives, don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away. The instruction was absolute. No looking back, no stopping, no lingering in the plain. What was about to happen was not meant for human eyes. The judgment about to fall was so terrible, so holy, so other, that even witnessing it from a distance would be fatal. The angelic command was not arbitrary. It was protective. But Lot, still negotiating even in the midst of salvation, asked to flee to a small town called Zoar instead of the mountains. Look, here is a town near enough to run to, and it is small. Let me flee to it. It is very small, isn't it? Then my life will be spared. Even now, with his city about to be incinerated, Lot could not fully trust God. The mountain seemed too hard, too far, too uncomfortable. He wanted a compromise, a middle way, a small town instead of complete separation from the civilization he had known. And remarkably, the angels granted his request. Zoar would be spared so Lot could shelter there. By the time Lot reached Zoar, the sun had risen over the land. It should have been a beautiful morning, the first rays of light touching the fertile valley, the cities gleaming in the early sun. Another day beginning in the prosperous plain. But this dawn was different. This dawn was the last dawn the cities of the plain would ever see. This dawn was the opening act of apocalypse. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. The text is emphatic about the divine origin of this destruction. It was not a natural disaster. It was not a volcanic eruption. It was not an earthquake that ignited the bitumen deposits. It was judgment, falling directly from heaven, sent by God himself. The Hebrew word for sulfur is gophrith, from which we get brimstone. It was fire that burned with an otherworldly intensity, consuming everything it touched, leaving nothing but ash and salt. The destruction was total. God overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land. The Hebrew verb translated overthrew is the same word used for turning something completely upside down. God did not merely burn the cities, he inverted them, he turned them inside out. He reduced them to their elemental components and rearranged them into a monument of divine wrath. The fertile valley became a wasteland. The prosperous cities became smoking ruins. The civilization that had seemed so permanent disappeared in a single morning. We can only imagine the horror of those final moments for the inhabitants. One minute they were waking up, perhaps nursing hangovers from the night's revelry, perhaps finally finding their way home after the mob dispersed, perhaps sleeping soundly in beds they would never rise from again. The next minute, the sky was ripping open above them. Fire was falling like rain. The very air was becoming flame. The ground was liquefying beneath their feet. Screams filled the air, but only briefly, because there was no time for screaming. The judgment was swift and complete and absolutely final. Meanwhile, Lot and his family were running for their lives. Behind them the world was ending. The roar of the flames, the crash of collapsing buildings, the thunder of divine wrath, all of it pursued them as they fled towards Zoar. The ground shook beneath their feet. The air grew thick with ash and sulfur. The heat at their backs was almost unbearable. And through it all, the command echoed in their minds, "Don't look back, don't look back, don't look back." But Lot's wife looked back. The text does not tell us why. Perhaps it was a moment of doubt about whether the destruction was really happening. Perhaps it was longing for the life she was leaving behind, the house she had decorated, the friends she had made, the social position she had achieved. Perhaps it was simply human curiosity about the impossible sounds behind her. Perhaps she turned to see if her sons-in-law had changed their minds and were following after all. Whatever the reason, she turned her body toward Sodom. And in that moment, she became a pillar of salt. The transformation was instant and total. One moment she was a living woman running for her life. The next moment she was a jagged pillar of crystallized salt standing in the midst of a burning wasteland. Her body had become a monument, a warning sign for all generations to come. Jesus would later reference this moment with 3 simple words: "Remember Lot's wife." She stands forever as an example of what happens when we are delivered from destruction, but our hearts remain behind in what God has judged. Why salt? The Bible does not explain, but the symbolism is rich and terrible. Salt preserves and prevents decay, so she was preserved at the very moment of her rebellion. Salt makes land barren, and she had chosen barrenness over fruitfulness. Salt was used in covenants, and she had broken covenant by looking back. The pillar of salt stood at the edge of what would become the Dead Sea, a body of water so saturated with salt that nothing can live in it, a permanent reminder that judgment had fallen and mercy had been refused. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord, the place where he had bargained for the cities, the place where he had dared to ask, "What if there are 10?" He looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. His nephew had lived in that valley. His negotiation had failed. There had not been even 10 righteous. Abraham stood in silence, watching the smoke of judgment rise to heaven, knowing that the God he served was both more merciful and more terrible than he had fully understood. But the story of Lot was not over. What happened next reveals the lasting damage that Sodom had done to him and his daughters. Lot left Zoar, afraid to stay there, and went to live in a cave in the mountains with his 2 daughters. The man who had been too afraid to go to the mountains when the angels commanded it now fled there voluntarily. The man who had offered his daughters to a mob now lived alone with them in the wilderness, and in that cave, cut off from civilization, traumatized by everything they had witnessed, the daughters devised a terrible plan. They believed they were the last people on earth. They thought the destruction had been total, that there were no men left for them to marry, that their father's line would end with them. So on 2 consecutive nights, they got their father drunk and lay with him. The text is clear that Lot was so intoxicated he did not know what happened. Each daughter became pregnant. The older one had a son named Moab, father of the Moabites. The younger had a son named Ben-Ami, father of the Ammonites. These 2 nations would trouble Israel for generations to come. The horror of this epilogue cannot be minimized. These young women had grown up in Sodom. They had been offered to a mob by their own father. They had watched their home destroyed and their mother turned to salt. They had lost their fiancés. They had been traumatized beyond anything we can imagine, and the methods they used, the deception, the intoxication, the calculated violation, these were the methods of Sodom. The city that had been destroyed by fire had left its seeds in the minds of its survivors. The infection had spread even to those who escaped. What are we to make of this dark and terrible story? First, we must recognize that God's patience has limits. Sodom was not destroyed on a whim. The outcry had been rising for years, perhaps decades. God had investigated personally. He had allowed Abraham to negotiate. He had sent angels to verify. He had given warning through Lot. He had provided a way of escape. Only when every possible avenue of mercy had been exhausted did judgment finally fall. But when it fell, it was absolute. Second, we see the danger of progressive compromise. Lot started by looking towards Sodom, then pitching his tent near Sodom, then living in Sodom, then sitting in its gates. Each step seemed small, each compromise seemed manageable, but the cumulative effect was devastating. By the end, he offered his daughters to a mob. His sons-in-law laughed at his warnings. His wife's heart was so attached to the city that she could not resist looking back, and his daughters had absorbed Sodom's values so thoroughly that they replicated its methods in a cave. Third, we learn that deliverance is not the same as transformation. Lot was pulled out of Sodom, but Sodom was not pulled out of Lot or his family. Physical salvation is not the same as spiritual renewal. You can be rescued from destruction while still carrying the corruption within you. The fire of judgment can rain down on the city, while the mindset of the city continues in the hearts of those who escaped. This is why Jesus warns us not just to flee the coming wrath, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. The Dead Sea region remains a testament to what happened that day. The lowest point on earth, the saltiest body of water on the planet, surrounded by barren hills and sulfurous deposits, it whispers of ancient judgment to all who visit. Archaeologists have searched for the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah for centuries. Some believe they have found evidence, burned layers, sulfur balls, destroyed structures. But whether the exact location is ever verified, the spiritual reality stands. There was a city. It sinned greatly. God destroyed it utterly, and he left behind a wasteland to prove it. What lies buried beneath the salt and ash? What secrets from an age of darkness were sealed under the fire from heaven so that humanity would never find them again? We may never know fully, but we know this. God saw what was happening in those cities, and he decided it must be stopped and never repeated. The destruction was not arbitrary cruelty. It was divine quarantine. It was the surgeon's knife cutting out a cancer before it could spread to the whole body. It was a God who loves humanity enough to judge the wickedness that destroys humanity. Jesus said that the days before his return would be like the days of Lot. People would be eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building, living as if everything would continue forever. And then judgment would fall, suddenly and completely, and those who had not prepared would be swept away. The story of Sodom is not just ancient history. It is a preview of coming attractions. It is a warning written in fire and salt for everyone who has ears to hear. The same God who judged Sodom will judge the world. The only question is, which side of the door will you be standing on when the fire falls? But there is good news in this dark story. Abraham bargained with God, and God listened. Lot was unworthy of salvation, but God saved him anyway. The angels physically grabbed him and his family and pulled them out of the destruction. God is in the business of rescuing people who do not deserve rescue. He sent his own Son to be the door of salvation, the way of escape from the judgment to come. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, not because we are righteous, but because he is merciful. The fire that fell on Sodom was terrifying, but there is a fire that fell on Jesus at the cross that is even more significant. He bore the judgment we deserved. He absorbed the wrath that should have consumed us. He became sin for us, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. The way to escape the fire is not to run to Zoar or hide in a cave. It is to run to Christ, to hide yourself in him, to trust that his sacrifice is enough to cover all your sin. So what will you do with this story? Will you dismiss it as an ancient myth, irrelevant to modern life? Will you argue about whether it really happened while ignoring what it means? Or will you hear the warning and respond? The angels are still calling. Flee for your lives. Don't look back. Don't stop anywhere in the plain. The judgment is coming, and the only safe place is outside the city. Jesus is still offering salvation to all who will come to him. The door is still open, but it will not be open forever. Remember Lot's wife. She was delivered from Sodom, but she was not delivered from her love of Sodom. She made it out of the city, but could not keep the city out of her heart. In the end, she became a monument to divided loyalty, a pillar of salt standing at the edge of judgment. Do not be like her. When God calls you out of darkness, do not look back. When he offers you salvation, do not hesitate. When he commands you to flee, do not stop to negotiate. Run to Jesus. Run to life. Run and do not look back. The fire is coming, but so is the morning. Choose which one you will face.